This is marriage under construction, so I have worn appropriate clothing. This is to let you know that I work for an outstanding carpenter and that I have a ruler in my life. And this is pretty heavy work, so there may be a little bit of sweating to do in this, and we'll be prepared for everything that happens. Now, by now you know, I don't have to tell you, that successful marriage involves a little bit of effort. Just a little. There happens to be something that an outstanding writer wrote, a guy named Wes Seeliger. I'd like to read it to you. The title of this is Bug Spray Number 5. Our wedding was on October 14, 1966, but our marriage began 3 weeks later. We were dressed up on our way to the swankiest restaurant in town. We had saved all week for the big splurge. One problem. My bride was wearing the most horrible perfume ever manufactured. It smelled like a mixture of mustard gas, black pepper, and vaporized maple syrup. I still get queasy thinking about it. We had stopped at a railroad crossing. It was cold outside. The windows were up. And the heater was on. My nose and lungs silently begged for mercy. But I didn't want to upset my bride with a comment about her perfume. I had decided the one perfect marriage in history would be ours. No conflicts, no harsh words, no hurt feelings, no tears, nothing negative. My wife had made a similar resolution. For 3 weeks, we had walked on eggshells, protecting each other from the slightest unpleasantness. Dare I break the spell? Dare I be honest and open? She had soaked in that blasted stuff every day of our marriage. I knew I couldn't hold out forever, so I said in my sweetest, softest voice, "Honey, that perfume smells like bug spray." Silence. Like the silence that must have followed President Roosevelt's announcement that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. I stared straight ahead, trying to concentrate on the steady metallic rhythm of the train cars rolling by. I glanced at my bride out of the corner of my eye. Her lower lip was quivering slightly, the way it still does when she's fighting a good cry. We drove on. After an eternity, she mumbled softly, "I won't use that brand again." Now, any married person can finish this story. We choked down our gourmet dinner, pouted, went through the "it's all my fault, honey" routine, shed tears, and were finally reconciled, promising never to be cross with each other again. Well, the whole episode is now part of our family lore, our repertory of young and dumb stories. But I still think our marriage began with my observation about the perfume. At that point, we began to grow. We discovered that marriage is a union stronger than emotions. We began to drop the foolishness about unruffled bliss. We took our first steps toward learning that one all-important lesson. A lesson no one ever outgrows. Love is a death-resurrection relationship. As for the perfume, I sprayed the rest on roaches. It worked. Well, it seems to me to be a natural question if you want to think in the same terms that evolutionary believers might think. Why even have marriage? I mean, actually, it isn't absolutely necessary, you know, for the preservation of the species. Why would God even bother to invent this? It doesn't have to be. From a naturalistic standpoint, you can do quite well without it. And we are finding, indeed, in our modern day, that many, for various reasons, are choosing or are forced to do without it. So why even have marriage? Well, first of all, God invented it, and that's probably a pretty good reason right there. In fact, as God invented the earth and began to put it all together, and what a remarkable job He did, as He moved along in its various stages, even before its completion, He would stop and say, "That's good." And it wasn't even finished yet. And He would work a bit more, and He'd stop and say, "That's good." And then He comes to that moment where He decides to build someone even in His own image. And He builds them. And He's alone. And He says, "That's bad." And it's the first time God had to say that. So He wanted Adam to not be alone. So He marches all the animals by to see if Adam is excited by any of them. And he isn't. But then God devises a plan. And so, in that first surgical procedure, preceded by excellent anesthesia, God produces Eve out of His side. And she's bone of His bone and flesh of His flesh. And now, God wakes Adam up, marches Eve by. And Adam goes, "All right." And then it was good. And so God invented this. Now, just the other day, I happened to catch just a few minutes of one of these nature specials that was examining a certain brand of chimpanzee, which this particular author was claiming was our closest relatives. And you know what his argument was in this? You see, this particular closest relative to us happened to be intensely promiscuous, totally promiscuous. And his argument was that that's what we're supposed to really be like, but social strictures have changed things. And I thought, oh no, that's just proof that we're not animals, that we're not chimpanzees, but we were created in God's image. In fact, it was so important to God, so powerful was this marriage sanctity, so important was it that He includes it twice, actually, in the 10 Commandments, which are those things He gave so that we could live joyfully. And He says, "You shall not commit adultery." Why would that be a problem unless marriage was terribly important to God? He says not to even covet another man's wife. Why would that be important unless marriage is terribly important to God, you see? Well, I guess in one way I still haven't answered the question fully. Why marriage? But you come to the New Testament and you hear Jesus, who, by the way, was the exact representation of God and the final word from God, the most accurate word from God. And he even tells us that, hey, God set this up so that a man would leave mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they two would be one flesh. Aha! Aha! We're on to something. That's what happened with Adam and Eve, right? Flesh of his flesh, bone of his bone. And now God has designed it so that marriage can be a step toward paradise, a step toward Eden, a way that we can begin to recover the joys that God intended for Adam and Eve in their situation, and now by this remarkable thing that God has designed, the process of going back to Eden, back to paradise, can begin. You may say, paradise doesn't sound like what I've been having. We better discuss this a bit more, huh? Well, that's what this time together is really all about. What are those steps to paradise, if you please? What might God have waiting on us? What might He have in store that will help us really begin to see in some whole new ways? Now, I propose to share some things with you in our time together that you may not have thought about before. In fact, I think I've made a certain discovery in Scripture that I hope will have you almost as one going, all right, so that's what it's all about. And it'll be like a 10-league boots back to paradise, just in that discovery. But now let's kind of travel a few years down the road. And as God begins to reveal Himself in the coming of Jesus, it sounds almost as if this marriage that He likes, suddenly He says, it's not all that important after all. It's like He comes to the traditions and breaks them. In fact, right at the very beginning, well, it was a terrible, terrible time in the history of Israel. For 400 years, no one had heard from God. It was terrible, terrible. I can see them asking, have you heard from God today? No, me neither. No. Have you heard? Yeah, no, me neither. But that 400-year period ended in a most unlikely way, actually. There happened to be a preacher. Now, I'm kind of partial to those types. But this guy was part of it. Well, they had more preachers, really, than they needed back then. Now, I don't want to comment on that any further. But, in fact, they had divided them up into groups, and those groups would take care of the temple procedures and what have you. And there were so many of them that in order to do the different things, they would have to draw straws, kind of have a lottery, you might say. And there was one particular fellow. His name was Zach, we'll call him for short. Zachariah is a little long. He was quite old, actually. As preachers go, he was a failure. Nothing ever came his way until one day. Oh, and by the way, he didn't have any children, which meant that was really, really bad back in those days. Not to have a child meant that you could never be anything. You were a total failure. In fact, in order to be a member of kind of the ruling body, to really make it in the religious world, you had to have a son. He didn't have a child. And now he's really old. And lo and behold, on this given day, to put the incense on the altar, they needed somebody. Let's draw straws. Let's have a lottery. Boom! Zach won. Oh, this is the crowning event of his life, the best thing he will have ever done, man. And he makes his way, he's old, into their place to put the incense on the altar, and poof, suddenly an angel. Hi, Zach. Hi. I have good news for you. Yeah? Your prayers have been heard. You're going to have a son. Sir? That's an old prayer. I haven't prayed that prayer in years. You think I'm old? You should see my wife. She is stricken with years. And the angel said, all right, you are going to have a son and you'll name him John. But because you didn't believe me, from till he's born, you're not going to be able to speak. Now he has this real problem, folks. He has to go home to Elizabeth and explain this to her, and he can't talk. Speak to me, Zach. You never speak to me. Sure enough, Zachariah and Elizabeth have a child on the way. He'll be John the Baptist, who will proclaim the coming of the Messiah. Oh, boy, can you see this? Man, here she is, really old, walking around, man. Everyone's noising this abroad. Wow. The other priests are probably really giving Zachariah the high five. Way to go, man. But what a strange thing to say about home life and marriage. It's almost as if God's into extremes, because the next thing you see, this angel has another visit to make. Poof. Different extreme. This time a very young girl. Many scholars believe she's probably not more than 15 years old. Poof. Hi, Mary. Or Hail Mary, well, whatever you want to say. I have good news for you. You're going to have a son. Sir, we have a real problem here. I'm not married. Never known a man. The angel said, don't worry. We have ways. And sure enough, Mary now, by the action of the Holy Spirit, is on the way to give birth to Jesus. But what is God up to when he does something of this nature? It's like he's breaking all of the traditions. John comes along, and he's to be named John, and everyone, wait a minute. We don't name our children that way. We recycle them through the family, and there aren't any Johns in your family. Well, I don't care. God said, name him John, and he's going to be John. And it was noised abroad. What's going on? All the traditions, the family values, dare I say, are being broken here. And to make it worse, you would think that God would have tried to make it better, but he makes it a little worse. We find Jesus as he ministers and marches through Israel, doing the things that being a Messiah meant to do. You find him restoring families. You find him restoring homes and giving a dead son back to his mother. But it seems that he didn't do a whole lot for family. Didn't seem like it anyway. In fact, in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and this is our construction tools, and I see that we have plenty of raw material out here. in the 3rd chapter of Mark, we find Jesus so crowded with people that he couldn't even stop and eat. They so surrounded him and pushed in on him. And in Mark 3:21, when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. Now imagine this. See, Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. Mary, I'm sure, had defended him and had pondered all of these things in her heart. But now, when the word comes back to him, your son has gone crazy, now they go to get him, and I can hear Jesus' brothers saying to Mary as they walk along, boy, I hope you'll quit this Messiah talk now, because we're going to get your Messiah, boy. He's lost his mind. And then when they get there, verse 31, Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Who are my mother and my brothers? He answered. Now stop right here, folks, and think. Put yourself in Mary's shoes. And you've just sent word in, your mother and your brothers are here, that we've come to get you. And you hear from the middle of the crowd, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? I think if I were Mary, I'd have said, come here, boy, I'll show you. I changed your diaper. Don't you talk to me like that. But then we make an amazing discovery, because right here, it says, he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother. Now we have a little secret that's just been revealed to us here in terms of the health and the strength of our marriages. If you go to your television sets and look at the specials they may have on tap for you, they may try to convince you that, you're just very close to a chimpanzee. So have at it. Be animalistic. You know. But you see, the biologists did not create marriage. They don't know. Or maybe if you turn on television and watch some of the things that have been produced, you see a certain thought about love has really messed things up for us, hasn't it? This term, making love, is most inappropriate, isn't it? Hollywood invented that. Doesn't necessarily, the way they put it, have anything at all to do with love. So much of what they talk about is just gushy feelings, you know. Romance is wonderful, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the way they put it together, well, you've seen it. There's a crowded room. A man is over here. A woman is over there. Their eyes meet. And the music begins. And there begins the Lord. And everyone, oh, isn't that wonderful? In 2 weeks, my wife and I will celebrate 38 years of being married. Thank you. We've been held together by my animal magnetism. We have had wonderful times. We have had terrible times. But we never had a... And the music... No. You see, This world doesn't do very good at putting marriages together. The only way it truly happens is a little secret right here, you see. At this moment, God pointed everything toward Himself. You see, you have kind of two families in a way. You have the family that you were born into. You really didn't have much choice. Let's call it a temporary family. I don't want to call it an accidental family, but you could almost call it that. I'm an Erwin. I had no choice about that. I didn't ask. Let me be an Erwin. But when I was born, oh man, the doctor looked at me, picked me up by the feet and hit me. He said, "It's an Erwin." But you see, that's a temporary family. I won't be an Erwin forever. Unfortunately, there will be some Erwins I will not see forever. But there's another family. And it's a family of choice. And it's an eternal family. It doesn't end with death, but it goes on forever. And it is the strength of that family that affects my temporary family more than anything else. When my heart is turned toward God and the proper tools are being used in the construction of my marriage, then I discover that I've latched onto something that has eternal properties to it. Until then, the best I will ever do will be in my own strength. And when Jesus said this, He was not destroying family at all. He was just telling you where its strength comes from, where eternal sources are. So you see, without this, we'll be in a lot of trouble. So God has designed that we be moving back toward Eden, that paradise be returning for us. And so He designed marriage. Well, I thought about that in terms of my own wife and life, and how this has worked its way out for us. And I began to realize that there are things that would be totally impossible for me to have if it weren't for marriage. Joys that would be completely absent for me if it weren't for marriage. Well, I would never be able to get anyone to actually put up with the bad habits that I have. I mean, there are sounds that men make. There are uncivilized ways that we are. I could never pay someone to put up with that. But I can marry it. The former Ada Faye Brown would never be able to get some human being to turn everything he has over to her, to do with as she pretty well pleases, and do it day after day, week after week, month after month, for 38 years. She could never afford that. But she could marry it. I could never afford, I could never purchase someone who would sincerely look at me without lying and say that I was the handsomest man in the whole world. I could never buy that, but I can marry it. Never pay someone to bear a child of mine and go through all the pain that has to be gone through to do that. And then not abandon it, but walk with it and care for it, not always with my cooperation. I could never purchase that. I don't have the means. But I can marry it. I could never pay anyone to sit up all night and wipe the fevered brow of a child and love it and think only of its concern. I could never afford that. But I can marry it. I could never afford to hire anyone who would do their best to encourage me, who would walk with me through my failures and tell me that it's okay and God's going to make it all right. I could never afford that. But I can marry it. My father was severely injured in an airplane accident when he was just about 29 years old. It left him disabled pretty much. His left side paralyzed, his brain damaged. And for the next 32 years, the woman that he married now became the breadwinner, took care of him through all the difficulties, moved with him, looking for medical help, looking for any kind of help we could find, putting up with his childishness now, doing her best to continue to keep him in his inadequacies as the head of the household, raising sons who were walking hunger pains. My father could never have bought that faithfulness, that love, that care. He could never have afforded it. It isn't really on the market, you know. But he was able to marry it. So you see, things that we need, things that are vital to survival and the joys of life, God has sewed them up in an event and in a life that was to be designed to begin to take us back to Eden and to show us what he really intended for us, what he had designed us to be. Married. Not alone. Well, if that's true, then why is it such hard work? Eden was not hard work. Maybe when you look at my husband, you might think that we're pretty close to orangutans. Well, here's a little discovery I've made. How hard a work it really is depends on which tools you use, you know. Now, I am one of the world's worst mechanics, carpenters, actually. This is so appropriate for what we are going through, but believe me, except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain who build it. And what I've discovered is my big inadequacies are the lack of certain tools. If you have a fine watch to repair, a sledgehammer is most inappropriate. But I've seen people try to repair their weddings or their marriages with sledgehammers. Yeah, now you'll run, right? Or else I'll hit you again. All I have is just a few wrenches and some screwdrivers. And you know, I try to save money, so there are a lot of jobs that I try to do around the house, and some of them are such hard work. Oh, I installed a new sink for my wife, and I put in the fittings and so forth, and it takes someone from a circus to get back up under that thing, you know, and to be able to do all of the stuff you have to do. And the faucet's been loose for my wife. Honey, can you tighten up the faucet? And oh. And so, oh man, and I hated plumbing work. Hated it. Then one day my wife and I were together at the hardware store, and I just happened to mention to the guy, I said, you know, I'm having real trouble getting the faucet on our sink to really, how do you do that? Oh, he said, there's a special tool just for that. Here's one, it's only $5. And I looked at it, and I said, where were you 5 years ago when I needed you? He said, well, this has been here for a long time. And sure enough, I went home and, oh man. And I realized that the more I use inappropriate tools, the more difficult the job will become, the more sweat it will be, the more I want to say, I don't know if I ever want to do this again. But when you have the right tools, it's like a piece of cake. All right. And this is where the right tools come into play. Now, I know something about Jesus. I know that he seemed to like marriage. In fact, the very first miracle he did, you know, was at a wedding. Jesus seemed to like parties. The first thing we see, really, where the miracles occur, he's at a party. A wedding party. A celebration. And he blesses it with his presence. But even more than that, it's like the party was just about to come to an end, and Jesus, well, I'll save your party for you. And there was no other reason for him to do that, folks. I look at that and I think, why? I mean, why not start off with a bigger show, at least a laser light or something that would spell out Messiah? But instead, he very simply saves a celebration, a party. What an incredible way to begin the miraculous. He must have liked marriage. But one little side thought in this, when his mother said to them, you know, do whatever he tells you to do, which, by the way, are the last words of Mary. Jesus says, well, get some pots and fill them up with water. And the servants did that, and he says, now take them to the head of the party. And they take them, and the head of the party is amazed. This is the best of all wine. It's to be served first. You've saved it to the last. How did you do this? A miracle had occurred. But take note that only the servants got to see the miracle. Only the servants were present when the miracle occurred. And the same tends to be true in our marriages. It's only when we discover servanthood that it becomes easy. It's only when our hearts are knit together out of a mutual desire to serve that we discover the tools are readily available and we know how to use them. I've heard people say, we want to have a 50-50 marriage. We're going to meet in the middle. Problem is, where is that? See, I would tend to say, I'm doing 75%. My wife would say, 75%? You're still in the starting block. You're not even started. But we have discovered that a major secret, a major tool, a broad way to Eden is when two people decide we're going to have a 100% marriage. I'm going to do everything I can to serve my wife and make life great for her. And she says, oh, I'm going to do everything I can to serve my husband and make life great for him. And then you don't have to worry where the meeting place is, because it's 100%, 100%. And that comes so close to heaven that you'll just about have to be raptured to get beyond that. My wife, who is serving her very aged mother at this moment in some of her final hours, came back just the other day from a visit with her with a sack that she put down in front of me. I looked at it and I immediately knew what it was. She says, I found this in my mother's attic. She says, I don't know what it was doing there unless we accidentally left it. You see, my wife and I carried on a long-distance courtship for, about the first 8 or 9 months of our courtship days. We would write each other every day. I fell in love with the post office during those times. I would always be there. I knew when they put up those letters, man, and I'd be there waiting as I'd hear them click, 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 click. When I'd open it up, oh, yeah, right. Ooh, yeah, okay. We kept all of those letters. It's a dangerous thing to do. And when she put it down in front of me and I opened it up, I knew immediately. That's what it is. Everything else was pushed aside for a moment, and I grabbed one of her early letters and opened it up and read it again. Oh boy, I really liked some things she said about me. Whoa, she was standing there beside me. Whoa. Said, would you sign this again? And as I read that, and I thought, this is incredible. Almost 39 years ago, these were the things you were saying to me. And even as I read it, tears were beginning to flow, and I was thinking, you know, love can be kept alive for 39 years. And as I read that letter, the thing that got to me was I realized that My wife had been so faithful in her servanthood to me that that letter that she wrote then that was filled with such compliments and things that she said about me, it was as if, but you said this just yesterday, honey. Oh. Yeah. When you grow in the Lord, you cannot help but grow together. It's just the way it works. Because God's very nature is to be loving. His very nature is to be serving. And I want you to see something about that in our next session that will give you some clues and tools that are remarkable in their ability to get you into difficult situations and suddenly make it, oh, so easy. Why didn't I know this before? But I've also discovered that we don't get married because we really don't have anything better to do on Saturday. You're not sitting here because, well, we flipped a coin. Heads we get married, tails we don't. Something brought you together. Something drew you to each other. You saw some things in each other that were so valuable you wanted to live with that for the rest of your life. And as I read that letter from my wife again, I thought, now I understand even better why I married you. If you would say that about me, I needed someone to say that about me. And I realized that I could never pay anybody to say that about me. But I could marry it. So for tonight, here's what I want you to do. For the next few minutes, I know that your program says small groups, and we're going to have small groups, very, very small. 2. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to reawaken something in your heart for each other. Now, you're going to be in a crowd saying this, but here's something I've discovered about when you get everybody talking, you don't hear anybody except the person you're talking to and who's talking to you. It works, trust me. But I want you to tell your spouse now, and this is this activity that we have planned for you, 3 things that you are absolutely delighted about in them. Not something you wish you could be delighted about if they would do. But something that you really like and you think is commendable and noteworthy. Now, guess who's going to go first? The men. Of course. Of course. And so, if you're watching this on video, then this would be a good time for you to do this with your spouse. Take the time to say, here are 3 things that I really, really like about you. And when you men finish, then it's your wives' turn. Now, one little clue. If you happen to get carried away, only in the sense of thinking of more, nothing else, and want to add to the 3, I will let you do that. I will let you do that. But now, as God who put you together watches and listens, here's one more little clue I want you to have. When Jesus said, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Looks around and he says, "Whoever does the will of my Father, that's my mother and my brothers." When that got through to me, I realized that my wife was, in a very real sense, Jesus' mother. See? Because she loves the Lord and does His will. I realize she is God's child first, even before she's my wife. She realized that I was God's child first, even before I was her husband. That changed everything. I began to realize, oh, I'm taking care of God's kid. Now, if you ever come and visit me and you want to be my friend, treat my children good. Don't look at my children and say, "Funny looking critters, aren't they?" Look, I know they have problems, but I love them. And God, who loves us more than we could ever love each other, remember, you're His kid. You husbands, that's God's kid sitting next to you. And God said, "I'm going to trust my child with you. And I'm coming back." So you see, that changes the whole picture. We've become each other's sacred trust before God. Now, just to muddy the water, not muddy the water, but to plicken the plot just a little bit here, thicken the plot. Jesus says, "As you have done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me." So you see, ladies, you're not just complimenting your husband. You're complimenting the Lord. And He's saying, "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Husbands, you're not just doing this for your wives. You're doing this for the Lord. And He's going, "Oh, thank you. Thank you. Ooh, thank you." So this little exercise is more than an exercise. It's a form of worship, really. It's a form of saying, "God, I like you, and I want you to know that. And I like you and what you have done for me here in my spouse. So, I'm going to pray, and then you start. Ready? Oh, Lord, what a wonderful thing you have done for us. How can we say thank you except to just live out who you are in our lives? Thank you that you gave us your children to take care of, and now we will gladly exhibit our desire to be your agent in what we will now say. Thank you, Lord, that you have given me in my spouse what I could never have purchased. But even as a pauper, I can afford because of what you have done. And I will now express my gratitude to you in this moment. Amen.